Okie doke, folks. I have a dear friend of mine that I haven't seen in a really long time, Melanie Harrington. I met Melanie. Were you hired by Project Change? 92, 93?
Ooh, yeah, 92, 93.
Yeah, she was hired by an anti-racist organization that was based in Valdosta, Georgia. It was one of five across the country called Project Change. It was funded by the Levi Strauss Foundation, and she was hired as an executive director of that initiative. So we worked together. I was a volunteer, and then after she left, I was the ED, the director of it briefly. That's a whole funny thing. But you'd worked for the Anti-Defamation League, I believe, before coming here, right?
The National Conference for Christians and Jews was what it was called then.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Did
it
that
was
turn into the ADL, or is that different?
no. I'm trying to think of what they turned into. I can't recall right now.
Yeah, that's
I think
okay.
they still kept the NCCJ, and I'm blanking out
Oh, that's
completely.
okay. It was in Atlanta, right?
It was, and
Yeah.
it was right out of graduate school.
Okay.
I knew I wanted to do some kind of work around racial justice issues, raising awareness about diversity. And they had a part-time position that was open, and that brought me to Georgia.
I gotcha.
And
Yeah.
so I was there probably about 9 months or so when I saw the ad for the executive director position with the Levi Strauss Foundation
I gotcha.
there in Valdosta.
Yeah. You have a master's degree in cultural anthropology. You're from Houma, Louisiana. And
No, no,
I
no,
thought you were from Houma.
no. No, I went to high school in Homa.
Okay.
And, I'm from Louisiana, so big oil and gas area.
Yeah.
So my dad, I'm originally from Vermilion Parish in Louisiana, Kaplan, Louisiana, which is a very small rural town. Um, a lot of rice farmers in Kaplan. That's like the main um, income producer there. Um, and all of the family, like all of the extended family, was there. But my dad acquired a position working for a natural gas pipeline company, and so that landed my brother and my parents and I in Homa
Okay.
just before I started first grade.
Okay.
So, and then I graduated from high school there. But that was the end of my experience in Homa. And actually, as soon as my dad retired, my parents moved back to the Acadiana region of
Gotcha.
Louisiana.
Gotcha.
And it's funny because I was really, most of my formative years, I was raised in Homa, but I've never thought of it as home, because throughout that time we visited, family for every significant event and holiday and back in
Yeah.
Kaplan. So,
Gotcha.
and I'm now in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. So,
Gotcha. You're a Cajun, and the thing that you made me appreciate was Cajun culture. I think you were the first person in terms of kind of brought that into my world. We worked together, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, which included going to anti-racism trainings and dealing with funders. And since then, you have been one of a variety of reasons I wanted to talk with you, but been involved in a number of nonprofits. You've taught in public ed, right? Some too. And most recently was or are still a part of a nonprofit that does kind of, um, I don't know how to put it, like cultural heritage preservation, particularly music and art, right? And you've done
yeah,
quite a bit of that work in that region, right?
the organization I'm currently employed by is actually it was legislated into existence by the Louisiana State Legislature for the purpose of looking at a bayou that runs through a main community here, um, reviving the bayou for recreational and economic purposes, And along with that, looking at the culture and the history that is connected to that waterway. So 30 years ago, the organization I work for now was established as a living history and museum and folklife park. And at that point, they focused really only on Acadian culture. The reality from a certain time period, from when the Acadians were exiled and ended in Louisiana, which was around 1765, to the right up to about 1900. So through the years, the organization has evolved dramatically. I've been there 5 years, but initially, you know, they didn't recognize the original inhabitants. And Louisiana is home to one of the World Heritage Sites in the United States for Poverty Point, which is an area that was inhabited by indigenous peoples 6,000 years ago. And we have lots and lots of, you know, artifacts and evidence of this very advanced, organized, you know, system of trade and culture. Yet this Living History Museum didn't recognize the indigenous peoples who were on the very land that was then occupied. Nor did it pay homage to people of African descent and their contributions. And really, for the time period that we're looking at in Louisiana, the majority of the population were enslaved for the, you know, a big chunk of that time period. So to have left them out of the narrative was just unthinkable. And so thankfully, before I came on board, we have a curator who was hired who has made huge progress in making sure that, you know, we have a more inclusive narrative for the area. But that's led to challenges for us from the community.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that some more.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, I think before we go there, I think the thing that interests me is that, you know, over the years, we were always talking about how do you act on some kind of anti-racist analysis, right? And a big part of it seemed to be, a part of it is like, well, how do you institutionalize certain things, right? And it sounds like, and I know you well enough to know you do this of, like, for example, what you just kind of laid out, this omitted history, right, which is kind of inaccurate, glosses over a lot of injustice and, you know, probably genocide and colonization and stealing of land as well as enslavement. So it sounds like a part of kind of anti-racist work is to make sure that the history is a complete one. Is that
Oh,
fair?
absolutely, absolutely. You know, and I have found that throughout my decades of work, um, it it's ridiculous how non-inclusive our Louisiana history curriculum is, for example, or our American history curriculum in the public schools here in Louisiana. So I think that's an ongoing challenge for all of us, to be inclusive and to be accurate, you know, and to tell the story from different perspectives, not from the perspective of the oppressor only. I mean, that doesn't give us a true history at all. So I think that's very much an ongoing challenge that we're faced with. And I think it's a large reason why we're in the predicament we're in this country right now.
Yeah. I think that what we have seen the last 4 years is really a backlash against the institutionalization of an accurate history.
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of pushback anytime you try to, for example, the organization that I work for currently, after the George Floyd murder, several museums in the community issued statements against institutional racism and you know, injustice around racism. Our organization, which is the only museum that looks at the history of the peoples in the area, had not done anything. So staff approached our executive director. He didn't feel like it was his place. He felt like it was the board's place to, make such a statement. The board didn't move on it. We several staff members tried encouraging them to make a statement and talking to them about the importance of why we needed to, as an institution that represented the history of the peoples of our region, why it was important that we make a stand, and just trying to raise people's awareness about the role of institutions, and especially cultural and historical institutions, in addressing issues of social injustice. So eventually a group of staff, there were 4 of us who drafted a statement, and I think it was 16 who signed it. And our organization has roughly like 55 people, I guess, altogether. But we drafted a statement, pretty much just fussing at the board for, hey, you're not representing us well. This is not who we are. This is not the organization we want to work with. These are the things that you really need to be doing. And we shared that letter at a board meeting, the result of which was we have 9 commissioners on that board, and 4 resigned.
Oh.
They resigned rather than vote in favor of a statement speaking out against social injustice and institutional racism.
Did they give a rationale?
One member said that he just didn't think it was the role of the museum to be doing that, even though we had laid out very clearly why. And we had also,
I have conservative folks that listen to this. Can you lay a little bit out of that rationale just so they'll know?
Oh, yeah. Well, we had just gone through a really intensive process of becoming an accredited museum. And so, we work very closely with the American Association of Museums, the AAM, and really work to look at the function of museums in contemporary society. And there's been an evolution in the purpose of museums. So, most reputable museums, and again, especially historical and cultural museums, see their role as very much an ally to marginalized groups within the community in a lot of ways, in that sometimes we're often the first organization to raise awareness about narratives that have been excluded, or even people whose histories have never been recognized before. And we're also very committed nationally. Many museums are very committed to DEAI efforts, and making sure that we've got different voices represented, that we're creating accessibility, we're creating a welcoming environment, that the stories of different groups, that those groups want to have shared, are being shared. And so what we saw as a natural evolution of that focus, which was a statement saying, hey, we're a community of that has a substantial percentage of African-American citizens. And as an institution that represents a part of, a shameful history of enslavement, and then what happened in Louisiana even after enslavement wasn't officially in place, in Reconstruction, we certainly have an obligation to speak out. So it resulted in 4 board members resigning. One almost immediately decided he wanted to come back. And I'm not sure why, but so he's back. And it's all, this board, because this was legislated into existence, the board members are political appointments. So they don't have to have any background whatsoever.
Wow.
And environmental, historical, or cultural work or institutions or anything.
Right.
But we have a very, very conservative mayor of the city where the museum is located. And so he basically replaced the other three with some folks who had even more rigid ideologies about what we should be doing. Yeah. So it's been a real struggle as an organization. And I should also say that these new board members also believe that that museums should be self-supporting organizations, which is very much not the norm. You know, most museum and our museum is supported through a millage that gets voted on by voters. I think it's every 6 years or so.
Like a millage rate?
Yeah. So for 30 years, the people in our community have recognized the value of the museum and have voted to support that millage to help fund us. And of course, you know, we like, for example, my department, we've acquired several National Endowment for the Arts grants and state arts grants and culture grants. But most communities that have museums recognize the value of the museum to the quality of life in the community. Not to mention in Louisiana, we're so hugely dependent on oil and gas, which is now, you know, slowly becoming a dying industry. And the second major industry in our state is tourism. And so that's all the more reason why you want to, you know, support your museums, because they certainly attract tourists. I mean, I don't know, we had like,
which trickles out economically, right, too.
Right, absolutely. The whole the impact that a few attractions have over the greater economy is worth the investment. So it's just been an ongoing challenge. And I think, you know, they really buckled down. They claimed that it was the budget and that we needed to be self-supporting. I firmly believe that was sort of a retribution for us speaking up and chastising the former board, because then that led to having to lay off many employees. And for example, my position was eliminated for a couple of weeks. Nobody could tell me why. In fact, the executive director told me that my performance was, quote, exemplary. And I was like, okay, so then, and I had really helped to bring income in through grants. But it was clearly, in my opinion, it was clear that I was an easy target because, you know, part of that organizing group.
It's kind of how it works, though, too, right? The retaliation is never said to be retaliation. It's just
of course
budget cuts, and you know,
it's always veiled as something else.
It really is, yeah.
And you know, and I think that that's a reality that we need to recognize. Now, thankfully, we've had at least one media source that has very, very clearly made the connection. And so in all of the stories that have evolved since this incident, they always look back to that statement that was made and say, you know, there seems to be a clear connection here. So, so there's, you know, the organization is still chugging along, but
well, and that's not like a high risk to me anyway, especially, you know, something that's funded through millage and through, you know, grants and so forth. It's not like you guys started a militant separatist, you know,
No, but
anti-racist.
interestingly enough, one of the board members who resigned had actually made a comment that he thought some of the staff were probably Antifa. And I mean, just
People talk out of their ass, man.
they really do.
Just,
They really do. So,
well, it's funny. I was talking to a student today of my former student of mine in Portland who was a part of the protest there. And I was just telling her that, and I've had students that were in Antifa, and I wish I could reach out to them because I'm sure they're just giggling for all this credit they're getting in a way. You know what I mean? Because they're, yeah, that's a whole nother thing. Have you run into, because the thing that's fascinating to me about living in this country is telling the truth about American history. It seems to be un-American. Like, have you run into like the way it gets framed? If you actually talk about slavery, if you talk about mass genocide, that somehow you hate the country or you hate your community. I mean, has that happened?
There's that, and there's also this notion that, you know, speaking, especially with students, African American students, about enslavement, just it isn't nice, you know, and we're in the South, and, you know, people value being nice.
It isn't nice to them, or is it?
Yeah, it's not nice to them. They don't want to hear about that because, you know, that was a painful part of history. We shouldn't be rehashing that, would be like some of the comments that I would get, you know. I mean, thankfully, I became an accredited social studies teacher later, a little bit later in life in my career. I had my kids later in life. And so when they went to school, I decided to make a shift to teaching for a few years. And at that time, I had been a supporter of the Southern Poverty Law Center for years and years. So I knew that they had some good teaching resources. And, you know, I was really, I think I was astounded that not more people, more educators were using them as a resource. But I felt like that there were some things that I could access and share with my students. A challenge educationally that we have, I think, is, well, there are a lot of challenges. I'm a huge public education advocate. I'm a total product of public education.
Me too.
But I think our system is broken, you know, dramatically, and for many, many reasons. And I just believe that we can do so much better than what we've been doing. And things get caught up in so much bureaucracy, you know. And in Louisiana, one of the reasons I'm not teaching anymore is, you know, I think you and I were speaking earlier about transparency. I'm real big on transparency and accountability. Like, those are just really important to me. And when I first started teaching, one of the things that was happening was Louisiana was going through this transformation with their curriculum requirements. And what happened was we had so many teachers who were not really good teachers that they decided that they would make the curriculum much more restrictive. So now it's gotten to a point where, and I don't know how this compares elsewhere, but now it's gotten to a point where there is a very rigid calendar and content that
like benchmarks.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter where the kids start, you know. Yeah. It's just assumed that it's a one size fits all and that all kids are going to be ready to start where they say they're going to be starting. And it's, I mean, to the point where they tell you, you know, what content to teach, how to teach it, even give you sample lessons for a lot of the, so they have basically, because of poor teachers, rather than looking at incentivizing education to get more qualified teachers, more impassioned teachers. They've sucked the craft out of teaching, and created this one size fits all model that doesn't work. It's a huge failure. I mean, and Louisiana is always second to last in education, basically, for the country as a result. And it's just contrary to all best practices that we've seen in education. So when that happened, I definitely did not want to stay in education. And part of the reason was because I worked at a lot of, well, all of the schools that I worked at were Title I schools where there were a lot of kids from poverty. The schools that I worked at for the first 4 years of teaching were at least 90% African-American students. So for me, it was absolutely ridiculous to not focus on African-American history and really try to center, lessons around that. And when I was not able to do that anymore because of this prescribed curriculum is when I finally just said, no, I'm not going to do this, So yeah, I think we have a really broken system. And even so now I work with education majors through a program with the local university here that produces a lot of the teachers for our region. And thankfully, there are some professors there who are much more forward thinking. One of whom actually has an anthropology degree. And so they've been very intentional in working with me around lessons for our museum and for that time period, and focusing more on teaching hard history. Like, it's not pleasant to teach about enslavement, but that wasn't a pleasant part of our history. It shouldn't be pleasant, So how do we do it in a way, that that centers folks who've been marginalized forever, and that focuses on their humanity, and resilience, and ways that people resisted. Louisiana had one of the largest slave rebellions in history. And our Louisiana history textbook literally has 2 sentences about it. Like, that's ridiculous, So
there's so much in there. A couple of things I'm thinking about. The question I always ask is, who is it uncomfortable for? Who is it? I mean, I think there's a way whiteness is centered in this a lot of times. It's because, I've taught for 20 years at the college level, and my students of color, and again, I think it has to be age appropriate, mind you, right? But utterly gobble it up, right? And it's my white students and white faculty who are the ones that are uncomfortable with it, who are the ones that generally try to undermine it, right? I think there's, it's a great example of kind of white supremacy built into the systems, right? And it's privileged in ways. And then when you try to decenter it, all hell breaks loose. Now, the other thing is, I don't know if I'd agree with the broken thing. I think the system, and I'm not a conspiratorial guy, but I just think about the system seems to be working. Like, I think maybe the result is supposed to still maintain the status quo. And one way you do that, right, is to make sure that the dominant group still controls the structure, the curriculum, the textbooks, the evaluation, the outcomes, the assessment process. And we've also seen kind of this business model applied, right? Like you said, one size fits all to public education. I would say it's been applied to higher ed too. So I think that's the distinction with, I remember this Chicana radical talking to me one time about colleges and universities. I was expressing my frustration that there wasn't this exchange of ideas, and this is where you're supposed to get in the meat of stuff. And she just started laughing. She goes, well, there's some big assumptions built in that. If you look at the history of American institutions, they were created for and by a particular group of people to maintain that group of people's power. So she wasn't it was interesting to see how she saw the institutions versus the way I did. And I started thinking, oh, man, she's probably right. Maybe they're not broken. Maybe they're doing exactly what they're supposed to. And the rest of us have been trying to nudge them, as have movements, right? Um, but it's interesting how whiteness kind of, what I guess you call whiteness, it pops up in this kind of stuff in terms of
Oh,
who gets to be uncomfortable and who doesn't. Does that make any
well,
sense?
I mean, Mark, even the students that I work with, a lot of from the university, the local university, a lot of the secondary education majors. So for social studies, that means they're getting certified for 6th through 12th grade. They tend to be slightly more diverse,
Mm.
um, but the elementary education majors is overwhelmingly,
White
white
women.
middle class females
Yeah.
who enter the profession, um, and and so often have just not had
Yeah. Any experience.
any life experiences with
Yeah.
diverse groups of people,
Yeah.
and yet they are creating this foundation, educational foundation, for really diverse populations of kids.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, well, maybe it isn't broken, but it needs a lot of work.
Yeah, no, I got
Uh,
you. Well, that's another really important point. And I see this here all the time. I've been talking to conservatives and did a number of podcasts with them. And it's fascinating how, and we all do this to some degree, they judge everything by their experience. That's the way the world is. If I can do it, anybody can do it. And it's pretty clear to me they've really never been around a lot of poor folks of color or poor white, some of them that are affluent, right? Even around too many poor white folks to know that there's this de facto segregation. There's a fancy word for it called white habitus in sociology, that white folks who can, especially have class privilege, move in these bubbles, right? So they never really find out if their perception of the world is different. The reason I bring this up is that as many issues as I had with Project Change, one of the things it did that I think was important is that white and black folks would spend time together. But I remember traveling with Joe Troop and a couple of his wife and another African-American woman, and driving from here to Louisiana, to New Orleans with them, and I've had plenty of black folks in my life as friends and so forth, but I haven't really traveled with folks. And the shit we encountered in Alabama, like when we walked into Shoney's. And so it was him, a female, and me, and another female who was African American. Like, as my mom would say, it got so quiet you could hear a rat piss on cotton. Like people drop, like we got the looks, right? So that happened a number of times. Then we get to the B&B we're staying at, and Reverend Troop had okayed a cashier's check, right, for us to pay for the room. And he gets up there to, pay as we're checking in, and the guy is belligerent to him. And here's somebody as an elder, just the sweetest guy, in the world, right? Kind, thoughtful, had done everything to get this thing approved, and he's being disrespected. And I'm getting pissed, and he's very calm, and, he does all this negotiating to work it out, right? And he does, and the guy never acknowledges that, his humanity in ways. And I was just like, so holy cow. It was like I saw it. I saw this thing that people had been telling me about, right? But then there was a part of me that was pissed at Reverend Troop for not telling this guy to kiss his ass. And I started talking to Reverend Troop. I was like, well, why didn't you say? And he was like, Mark, you don't understand. If I raise my voice like you can, the police will be here. And it was like such and it, you know, you were, oh, yeah, this shit's real, you know. But if you, you know, man, just if we don't move with each other in our worlds, we don't see what's happening to folks. And I've also had, you probably have too, a lot of Black folks in my life, and Chicano people and Latino and other folks that'll be with me out in the world, and they'll discover some shit that I get that they don't get. They're like, you gotta be kidding me, man. You don't have to do this, you know. But so I think about that as teachers, you know, as well as kind of missionary mentality. I see it a lot in nonprofits, you know, that we're going to go save these folks or these, versus having any lived experience, any understanding of these communities that people go in, no historical sense of why people are in the situation they're in whatsoever. I mean, does that resonate at all?
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's we're so steeped in white privilege, and the privilege of not having to ever look beyond this bubble, right? Um, that it's I don't know, it's earth shattering when we finally have that kind of an experience. I mean, I remember we had gone to a training in Knoxville, and we had folks from the People's Institute who were going to be there as well. And we had just arrived at the hotel, and everybody was kind of hugging and greeting in the lobby because we had come from different places. Um, and Ron Chisholm was in front of me, you know, and he went to check in, and he handed the guy, the reception guy, his credit card, and the guy said, I'll need to see some ID with that. And I was watching because I was right behind him. And so I'm, you know, digging in my purse to get my ID to go with my credit card. Well, he checks Ron in, and then he checks me in. And so, you know, he tells me, you know, what I need for my credit card. I hand him my credit card, and then I go to hand him my ID, and he's like, no, I don't need your ID.
Yeah.
And I was like, you just asked him for his ID.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, you're okay. You're okay. But that tiny little, you know, that difference. And I think it's those, you know, some people would say it's like a microaggression, but for white folks, we have no idea. That was like one incident that just resonated with me, and I was so upset about it. And I later talked to Ron about it, and he was like, that's just one of many every
That's
day.
life. Yeah.
Yeah. And all I could think of was, oh my God, it took so much of my energy watching my friend be treated this way. That was so unfair, that I couldn't imagine having it happen to me directly multiple times every day, and, you know, in so many different ways. And I'm forgetting.
Well, no. We were talking about kind of education and these
Oh,
kind of white women that are going to be teaching typically kids of
well,
color from a world that they know nothing
yeah.
about other than stereotypes and misinformation.
Well, and here's I think it's part of the big challenge, and it's still education because, right, we're educating our teachers. At the university level, most educators are required to go through one class on diversity, all forms of diversity.
That's everybody too, right? That's sexuality, ableism.
Every form of diversity.
Yeah.
And it's there's some information, but because you've got one semester, you've got so much to look at, it's really hard to have the type of impact that you need to have. I mean, I just think that needs to be a bigger part of preparing our educators, you know, by a long shot. Um, so that's one challenge, and then another challenge, and you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to get back to it, is the business of textbooks. Like, I hate textbooks, and I don't use the word hate that often, but I hate textbooks, especially in social studies. Um, and it's big business, it's such big business. And most of the major textbook producers, at least for the South, are out of Texas, I think it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And I, I just think they're so inadequate for so many reasons. One is I don't think they're tools to create critical thinkers. I think they water down a lot of information to get it condensed in this one book. Um, I think we'd be much more effective educationally if we had students explore more primary sources of information,
Yeah.
and look at them critically and analyze. And I think that's another part of what's happening in our country right now, is that people are not media literate. They don't know how to distinguish what's real news and what's really biased, or what information is factual and substantiated versus hearsay. That's a big failure of our education system.
Yeah. Well, do you think, I mean, it seems to me underneath this, there's kind of, am I fuzzy, by the way? I don't have my glasses on. I can't really tell. Do I look
I've got
clear to
my
you?
contacts on, so you look fine to me.
Okay, no worries. It's probably just my very old eyes. Um, I wonder too, deep down, if kind of racism, not to make, every problem a nail, and, racism's the hammer, but there's a part of me that thinks white Americans, because we've been inundated and indoctrinated to think people, especially with black folks or brown folks, are less than human or maybe potentially violent, that if we tell the truth, what are they going to do? I mean, do you ever feel that? Like, do you think that that's anything behind the reluctance of us as a nation to tell the truth, that we'll have to come to terms with it? And also that they may, you know what I mean? I hear this among conservatives, and especially in this last election cycle, where there's just some old school racist fear that there's going to be truth and reconciliation and reparations, and they're going to come kill us. I mean, one person even said, compared it to South Africa, where they're going to put tires on people and set them on fire if they're the
Oh
white
my
man.
God.
Yeah.
God, I find that so ironic, because when we look at, again, what has just happened in our history,
Yeah.
This overwhelmingly white mob was much more violent in this insurrection that uh, was just utterly repulsive and disgraceful. And these were the same people who were concerned about Black Lives Matter protests,
Yeah.
and the violence that might happen around those protests, and for my friends of color, they're sitting back like, yeah, we kind of knew that this was what was
Yeah.
going to happen. We're not surprised. We're
Yeah.
not surprised,
Yeah. They'll be surprised if folks actually go to jail and are prosecuted, I think.
Right.
At least folks in my life,
Right. I mean, even the vice president elect, she was interviewed this past week, and asked about her reaction to what had happened, and if she was surprised, and she was like, "No, I'm not surprised," and I wasn't surprised with what happened with George Floyd, and I wasn't surprised. Unfortunately, when I saw a photograph of Emmett Till, I mean, just throughout her life, she named all these instances where
Yeah.
things were unjust, and she was not surprised.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what motivates whites who are so reluctant to talk about the actual history, of our nation and the actual privilege that we have. It's something that perplexes me that we're still fighting
Yeah.
this fight. Um,
Well, given that, can we go back to 1993 for a second? Because
okay.
it's kind of cool to get to talk with you, given all the work we did, through the 90s, right? Um,
Can I
what? Go ahead.
can I ask you to pause the interview for like 2 minutes?
Yeah. We'll take a little break and you can take care of it.
Okay, I'll be right back.
No worries. All right. Yes, we took a little break. Before you left for the break, it's kind of cool to get to talk with you some. I'm trying to do the math right now. 8 years later.
It's
Like,
crazy.
and just so folks will know, if anybody listens to this, is that, when the kind of anti-racist stuff that was going on in the 90s, this is before the kind of whiteness literature blew up. Race and race studies became kind of an industry, I would argue. But I just remember some of the stuff we were trying to do here in Valdosta. And it's interesting because now there's an initiative to have courageous conversations locally. And I think that's great, but I'm dialogued out. For me, I think that conversations can be traumatizing if they don't lead to action, and exploitive and voyeuristic. And we could talk about that. But I remember I just wanted to go down memory road with you for just a second, because I remember I got sent to negotiate between the black and white Christmas parade here. I don't know if you remember that, but we had segregated Christmas parades in the mid 90s. And one of my jobs that I got tasked at Project Change as a volunteer was to try to get these guys. And one of them was a conservative shock jock, the white guy. And black folks had so many bad encounters downtown when they did an integrated parade that were violent, that they were like, the hell with this, we'll just have our own thing. But we did that. We approached the school systems and tried to partner with them about multicultural education. Yeah. What else did we do? I mean, we had a lot of dialogue.
Well, okay. So, so I get hired, and my last name is Harrington, and clearly I'm a white woman.
Yeah.
A very interesting dynamic for me, though, was that most of the Harringtons in Valdosta were African American. And I can remember within the first couple of weeks of me being there, I had requested a meeting with the mayor just to introduce myself, to talk about, why this was a good thing for us to be doing this. And I didn't want anybody to think of us as the enemy. I wanted people to realize that there were a lot of good people wanting to see a lot of good come from this.
And you were trying to include stakeholders and the usual suspects, the chamber, because we did microeconomic development stuff, incubator stuff. Right.
Yeah. So I had requested this meeting with the mayor, who I'd never met before. He didn't know me. And at this point, there had been no picture of me anywhere publicly. Like the newspaper had not yet said, hey, this is Melanie. She's the new person at Project Change. So I was in the waiting area for the mayor's office, which his receptionist or secretary was there as well. And I arrived early. I'm always early for professional meetings. And let's say the meeting was at 2. I was there at a 2:45. And at like 2:15, he still wasn't there. And the receptionist, I could tell, was getting uneasy. And he strolled in. He walked right by me, glanced at me, looked at his secretary, and said, so did the Harrington girl show up yet? And you could tell she's like trying to indicate to him that that's her. And he was so taken aback by that.
Mm.
Oh, it's like he couldn't get himself together quick enough to accommodate me and my white self, but he had no problems being 15 minutes late for a meeting with somebody who
He
I think it's
assumed.
pretty safe to assume he thought was going to be African American.
Yeah.
You know,
Was this Nigel? Do you remember?
he was short. He wore a big cowboy hat.
What was it? Was it Nigel? It was the guy after Nigel. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
He really looked like somebody who could have been a character on Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like honestly. Um, and so we ended up having this very brief conversation. But it was clear that he was so uncomfortable for the entire thing because I totally did not fit what he expected.
Yeah.
He didn't expect me to be white, and then that totally messed with his thinking about this being an anti-racism initiative. I mean, certainly you had to have a person of color working on an anti-racism issue. So that was sort of my like, all right, this is what we're dealing with. But having been from South Louisiana, I mean, it kind of went along with what I knew from here.
Yeah.
And that also, talking about white privilege and not having to engage in certain things. Another really memorable time in my evolution of looking at who I wanted to be and the work I wanted to do and the work I needed to do on myself in order to do it came when I was in graduate school. Actually, I had just wrapped up my graduate studies. It was one of my very last days at my department, and I was going around having all of my advisory committee members sign off on my last paperwork. One of my advisors was Dr. Ben Magabani. He was a Black South African who had been exiled from South Africa in the 60s because of his efforts to try and end apartheid. He left South Africa as a young man once he was exiled, and he went to, I think it was UC Berkeley, to finish his studies. But he also is known as one of the originators of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. And he was just such a wonderful human being and had always just been very gentle and kind and supportive and very reflective. Like he was not one of these professors who'd like to hear himself speak. When he said something, it was very much worth listening to, and it was always thoughtful, So I go up to Dr. Magabani and ask him to sign my paper. And so he looks at me and he says, "So Harrington, what are you going to be doing now?" And I said, "Oh, Dr. Magabani, I don't know. I've applied with Amnesty International. I've applied with the Carter Center. I had applied to all of these jobs that had like an international focus on human rights. But my master's work had focused on human rights and race relations. And he like real quietly leaned forward and he said, you should really go home and work with your people." And that was one of those aha moments. Like, it was so glaringly obvious, but it wasn't noticeable to me. I was living in my little white bubble, looking at
The world.
Yeah, looking at social justice issues as being outside of me, and it was life-changing for me. And really, it's why I stayed and did the work that I did, and still continue to do the work I do. He passed away a few years ago. I was saddened to learn because I don't know that he ever knew how fully he had impacted me.
That may be how it works sometimes, though, too. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we don't know what our words do, like sometimes.
And as I've gotten older, I really try to let people know,
Yeah.
like you really had an impact on me. I can remember when I was in high school, and one of my really good friends from high school came out to me as being lesbian, and my reaction, it wasn't hateful, but it wasn't supportive,
Yeah.
and I'm so ashamed of that now. But like years later, uh, when I've definitely had more of an awakening around gender and sexuality, um, and certainly want to be an ally. I reached out to this dear friend of mine. Her name was Lori, and I said, I want to apologize. Like, you shared something with me that was really important, that was really something sacred to you. And I did not embrace it and embrace you in the way that I should have. And that was my own ignorance, my own small mindedness. And I'm so, so, so sorry. And she just laughed. She was like, "Oh my God, I don't even remember that." And I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like,
Well,
"Are you
that's where I
serious?"
was. Yeah. Well, and
I was like, I felt terrible about this for so
yeah,
long.
but do you ever wonder though? I mean, there's this way supremacy operates in us, like like that story, for example. Um, there's so much of this that happens that's not personal. Do you know what I mean? Like your inability to be loving and embrace her wasn't, it's just that you didn't know and you had your own baggage that you didn't create yourself.
Yeah, I was
You
17
know,
years old at the
well, I
time.
know, but like and you've seen this, right? I think the danger of that sometimes is there's something about white folks that, but there's something about whiteness, I think, that is really inhuman, because I think we can be, and I'm not saying you did this with this example, but I see it all the time. Um, for some reason, we think we're supposed to have known everything. Like, and I fucked it up, and I'm, so, you know what I mean? And then people have all this guilt, and they're such a terrible person, and how could they? Versus, no, that's how this works, right? Um, I don't know everything. I am a product of my culture, my biography, right? And that doesn't let me off the hook, right? And I think we should call folks up and make amends. And like you said, they probably, didn't even notice. But I've always wanted to talk about white paralysis. Like there's all this stuff about white fragility, right?
Yeah.
Um, but there's also this white paralysis that I think is driven by internalized superiority, that we're supposed to have the answer, that we're supposed to have not be racist, that we're supposed to not be sexist, and all these other things too, right? That if we're not careful, really do paralyze us, and also can create extra work for other people to patch us back together. And you know what I'm
Exactly.
talking, I'm talking about. So I try to, I guess all that's to say is that, and I certainly haven't been good at this, they're like self-compassion as we discover all the things we don't know. And sometimes they're hurtful, and
Well, but I think
does that make sense?
it
Yeah.
makes total sense. And I mean, that gets back to where, white privilege, white supremacy, it hurts us. It's so hurtful
Yeah.
because we have these unrealistic expectations of ourselves, um, that we should know everything about everything, because that's who whites are supposed to be. We're supposed to be
Yeah.
so dominant, so knowledgeable, and it's so bogus.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, you have these moments where you realize that it's not all about you
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the aha moment.
Well, that, and I think it's okay to feel the hurt that comes out of our ignorance, right? And be with that and to own it, right? But also some self-compassion in the sense of, man, I just know the world I'm from, like, and it's a small one, and this is cracking it open.
Yeah, and I think we need to be careful not to use that as an excuse too.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah,
Because I've seen a lot of white folks use, well, I wasn't raised that way. Yeah,
yeah,
but you
no,
know better, so you
yeah,
should do better.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I wasn't raised that way.
yeah.
Well, my God, does that mean there's supposed to be no evolution of your thinking just because you weren't raised that way, that's a frustrating comment for me. This also links, though, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. So I was raised in the Catholic Church. So I'm a Southern white person who was raised in the Catholic Church. I'm definitely not a practicing Catholic because I don't agree with a lot of things about Catholicism, but I consider myself to be a really spiritual individual, right? And I'm always striving to work on that spiritual aspect and humbling myself and trying to understand how I can do better, how I can know better and how I can do better. And, but I think a lot of what happens and I know Southern Georgia is like very Christian.
Fundamental evangelical too.
In South Louisiana, it's incredibly Catholic. This is one of the most Catholic regions in the nation. And it's interesting to me, and you and I have had this conversation, like when I think of who Christ was as a person, that is not what is reflected in a lot of organized religions that claim to be Christian, in my opinion, So for example, my kids, I have a 20-year-old and an almost 19-year-old. And I told you, I'm a big public school advocate. They have been in public schools here in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, from pre-K through about 8th grade. When my son was in 8th grade, my daughter was in 7th grade, their father took me to court because he wanted, and I was a domiciliary parent, he took me to court because he wanted his children to receive a Catholic education. I was not okay with that. I had done my research. The Catholic school that he was advocating for, when you looked at their best performing students and the best performing students from the public school, they were neck and neck, my kids had the best of public schools. In South Louisiana, French is widely spoken here still. Both of my parents spoke French as their first language. It's part of that Acadian culture. So we have a lot of French immersion programs. We also now have some Spanish immersion and Chinese immersion programs. But at the time when my kids were starting school, if you wanted to have your kids in an immersion program, it was French. And I was very excited about that. So my kids were in a French immersion program. They were in gifted programs, they were in talented programs. They had the best of the public schools, and they were both exceptional students. They tested at the top of everything. So he had no argument to say that they weren't excelling in public schools, because they really were. However, the hearing officer that we had, she herself personally was Catholic, and she had children at the school that he wanted my children to go to. And she ultimately ruled, even though I was a domiciliary parent, and that really should have been my decision, she ultimately ruled that as long as he was willing to pay for this private education, they would go to this Catholic school. And that's where they ended up having to go for high school. Now, the public school that they were in, even though we're in South Louisiana, was incredibly diverse, because the parish that we live in, after the Vietnam War, when there were Vietnamese relocating to the United States, Louisiana had a lot of Vietnamese folks relocate here because the climate is similar. There were a lot of people who had been in fishing industries, and so it was a really good fit.
There was a lot of conflict over that in-migration too, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, but now we're at a point where, thankfully, my kids were in a school in deep South Louisiana where they had an incredibly diverse and in a rural area too, an incredibly diverse student body. So they had white kids, they had African American kids, they had a lot of Vietnamese American students who were in classes with them, and Muslim kids. I mean, it was just a really great, diverse environment. They moved to this Catholic school, and that's what they knew. And I'm so grateful that they had all of those years in that environment. One of my arguments against the Catholic school was that it lacked diversity. And I had even gone to like an open house. I was trying to be open-minded and do my research. When I went to the open house, there were all white parents, there were all white student ambassadors, and there were all white staff. Okay. All white. Okay. So we go through the night to have a tour of the school, the whole bit. At the end of the night, the assistant principal, who of course is white, says, so Miss Harrington, what did you think of the experience, whatever? And I was like, look, the kids were really sweet. The student ambassadors who met with us, clearly there's a good focus on academics, whatever. But I said, I have a very genuine concern that there is a lack of diversity in the school. And she proceeded to say, well, what do you mean? And I said, I mean, all I've seen all night are white folks. Yeah. And this is not the world we live in. And it's not the world I want my kids schooled in. It's a better world with diversity. I don't like this insular kind of environment. And she said, well, this is probably going to sound racist. I was like, because it's gonna be. And she says, but I kid you not, and this is 4 years ago, but no, 5 years ago now, our basketball team had an away game tonight. And so I was like, yeah. Wow. So you're literally telling me that the only Black kids you have at this school, the only diversity you have in this school are, Black kids, and they're all on the basketball team. Are you trying to tell me that? Well, that's not exactly what I mean, but we would have had. And so I was like, okay, so what about your staff? Well, we had a Chinese chemistry professor, but he resigned. And I was like, I have a background. Classic. I have this background in diversity and race relations. I'd be really happy to do something with this school at no charge, at no cost. Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. Well, in the end, the courts ruled against me. My kids are in this environment. But, thankfully, they had the experience of their public school education. They naturally gravitated to the few kids who are non-white on their campus. And they were also, empowered to speak up.
Yeah. How old's the school? When was it created?
Turlings was probably created in the 70s.
You know why?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
No, that's huge. Most folks, like the private schools here, when you look at their creation, some were created as a response to desegregation.
Oh, it's definitely.
But you were going to ask me something about spirituality in there.
Well, so for me, like around Catholicism, there's this common theme of Catholic guilt.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times white folks just think that, at least here, that if they really feel bad about something, if they really didn't intend it and they just feel bad about it,
that's doing something.
That kind of forgives them for not doing better.
Yeah. I guess I see it more. I mean, I'm thinking about liberals, though. I'm not thinking about conservatives. I'm thinking about liberal guilt, liberal white guilt. oftentimes. And I've seen it really kind of hobble work, in a way that there's still this thing of, you can't make any mistakes. You should have known that this was right. You know what I mean? And sometimes there's not a space for that, but I don't know. I mean, most religious folks I know have all kinds of guilt, regardless of Protestant or Catholic, but
Well, and that
yeah,
was, I guess, one of the questions I had for you around that.
What was I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Was, this is predominantly Catholic,
Yeah.
but, I know there's like a large Baptist community.
Yeah. I've been talking to evangelicals as of late. I've had a couple of folks been nice enough to talk with me on the podcast, and just the overt racism. Now, I think what happens now with charismatic churches, there'll be a few folks of color in there, and then you can kind of see, we're inclusive. But people have heard me say this before, but the whole white Jesus thing, the fact you can take a Middle Eastern religion and turn Jesus and God into a Caucasian is deeply problematic. But I think where you were going a minute ago, and other folks have heard me say this too, I would say, and I'll probably get in trouble for this, but like, I know even I talked to evangelical the other night that doesn't think I'm a Christian because I don't care about the divinity of Jesus. I don't even really care if it's a true story. I think whether it's just such a deep myth, or if it's a true story, if he's God, whatever, it doesn't matter to me. It's a model for how to live. It's a model for how to have a good society. And that's the most difficult part of it. Like, to try to live up to certain standards, and not know what's going to happen if anything happens after this, right? That to me speaks more volumes. And I just, that's a very different version of Christianity, and it's just liberation theology, than I've got all the answers, we're bad, God became a human, he sacrifices himself to get, I've had some interesting, to me, and I've said this before too, so people are going to get sick of hearing it. There's a kind of abuse model in that for me. This kind of that love is conditional based on this patriarchal model of a man God, right? That's limited to a gender, that you either love or you're going to be in really deep trouble, and I shared with one of the people I talked with, Bill, the other night, that just reminds me of my home life. And what Bill said to me was, maybe that's your problem. Maybe you're projecting your home life onto God. And I would say, no, and I didn't say this at the time, but I think, no, my home life was modeling itself after this version of God, that the man has all the power, right? Which leads me into a different question. I don't know how much time you got, but because I got a zillion of these things. going back to the race work, though, we really were, and I never saw it because I was blind to it. And let me back up too. I hope I didn't offend you by saying Cajun. Acadia is different, right?
Yeah. No. It's Acadian is just Cajun is just an abbreviation. Colloquial language for Cajun. It just, Acadian became Cajun.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so that's
okay.
Not offensive at all.
Okay, no worries. Just wanted to check because I didn't know because Acadian seems to be more specific with a direct history, right, timeline and so forth. But
yeah, I mean, some people, what we've had in this region of South Louisiana is, a lot of people from outside of the immediate culture have come in, and they embrace the culture, and they really want to be a part of it, and kind of consider themselves honorary Cajuns.
Y'all got the best food. I mean, I still think of the shrimp etouffee you made for me when I came through and visited you years ago. Like, I still dream of that.
That was a big challenge for my daughter. She just went off to college in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And her college was known for having a nice food program, cafeteria program.
Yeah.
But he's like, yeah, Mom, I'm eating a lot of salad.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask you is that, like, how did you manage the sexism in Project Change? Like, was it, do you know what I mean? Like, because one of the things that we struggled with, and I've struggled with men of color, folks of color love me generally because when I talk about race, but if we talk about gender, we talk about sexuality, or we talk about militarism or capitalism, like everybody wants to focus on kind of one thing. So I'm just kind of looking back.
I was like, what, 30 years old or so at the time. And a lot of the people that we were working with were older than I was. And coming from the Deep South, there's this respect for elders, right? That's ingrained in you.
Is it fair to say there was sexism in Project Change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there definitely was. I think that my way of reacting or responding to that at the time, because I didn't want to break a connection that had been built around doing, trying to focus on our anti-racism work, was to act as though, to respond as though the person who had just done or said something that was really sexually inappropriate or offensive had not meant to do that, So I would clearly say, yeah, basically,
yeah,
you're really joking, right? Because you know that that's not okay. And then, of course, they would step back and say, oh, yeah, I was just joking around. Now, the joking about it was okay either. But at that point in my personal evolution, I was really focused on doing anti-racism work. And as a woman, at that point in my life, I had only had a couple of instances where I really felt that, and because I wasn't as fully aware, of course, as I am now, but that I really felt that my gender had led to people treating me differently, or had been a disadvantage for me because of people's preconceived notions. I think as you go through life, you begin to evolve in different ways around different issues, The other thing for me too at that time, Mark, was that it's not like it was a competition about oppressions, but even though I was a woman, I was still white, and that was really clear to me, that my whiteness was a bigger playing card in my favor than being a woman was against me, kind of.
Especially in that context, probably, right?
What's that?
In that particular context.
Yeah. And of course, that was before we had this whole thinking or conversation going about intersectionality and, how that impacts us and what that means to us. I mean, it's funny because when you and I reconnected recently, it was because I was looking over some of my Project Change. When I left as the executive director to move back to Louisiana, I don't know if you remember this, but the board had put together this, it was sort of like a scrapbook, where several people had included letters or newspaper clippings of my time there, pictures of them and their families. I mean, it was a really
nice.
It was one of the it was the nicest departing gift I've ever had from any job. And I hadn't looked at it in many years, and I looked through it. Um, and it was interesting because I think that I was assertive in a friendly way. Does that make
Yeah, I would
sense?
say that.
So that a lot of the older men that I worked with, a term that frequently came up was firecracker. Like, so they saw me as this firecracker, you know. And I think they meant that endearingly.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
But it was interesting that it was sort of an exceptionality for them, that
Yeah.
there was an assertiveness that they could handle.
Yeah.
From
What
a
do you, I mean, this is probably a stupid question because I just see you as feminist.
Oh God, yes.
You know what I mean? That was the F word we really didn't talk about. And I get it.
Yeah.
You know, the other, well, and you know, we were trying to figure shit out too back then. I mean, it was complicated in many ways, you know, and then later on after you left, the class dynamic, which was something we really
Never addressed.
you know. So it was a wild time, you know,
It was.
to say the least.
You know, I have to say that we managed to get some things done.
Yeah.
That even now, when I look back, I'm like, dang, that was the early 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, considering the context, considering the time, it kind of blows my mind that we were able to do some of the things that we did.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of genuine love and good intention among a lot of the people who were involved. Not everybody was maybe as informed as, you know, we think people need to be when they're wanting to do it. But I think small acts and small kindnesses matter.
Yeah.
And people were doing the best they could with what they knew.
A lot of us didn't know what we were getting into.
No.
You know, you enter in it thinking that racial justice looks this way, then you're going, especially the white person, right? For me, I had this kind of racist notion. Well, this is about people getting to be like me, you know, versus, oh, no, this is going to change everything.
Right.
On the individual level in particular. So the personal transformation thing is really, really deep. And then we ran into kind of the structural barriers of doing stuff, which is just the reality, right?
But one of the things that I think resonated with me was that we were able to, you know, and at that time, oh gosh, at that time, I was trying to think of the term, the legislation. At that time, there was the Community Reinvestment Act that held banks a little bit more accountable about fair lending practices. You know, since then that has dissolved. I wish they would reinstitute that, but not a lot of banks. And I mean, the banks in Valdosta were very white male dominated at that time, right? But I hope that we had some kind of an impact amongst bankers and amongst the loan officers in particular. That was a focus. I remember that I thought that was going to be our hardest group because they were overwhelmingly white, male, middle and upper class, right? And yet it just took, there was like one white bank president who was all in. And that really, it created this momentum. Just that one person. And that's one of the things that I think I have to remind myself of. Like, you know, that one person saying and doing the right thing can have such a ripple effect. You know, people don't, I think a lot of times people think, well, I'm just one person. When in fact, there's a lot of power and saying and doing the right thing, even if you are just one person. Um, and what it did was it opened some minds to considering the fact that they have been biased in their lending practices. And, I don't know what lending looks like now in Valdosta, but for that period in history where we had those bankers who were willing to come to some diversity trainings.
Some went to New Orleans with us, like went
Yeah.
to People's Institute stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that for that moment, we were opening some minds and some hearts and hopefully creating momentum towards more economic justice. Um, that was really powerful.
Getting to
Multicultural, the focus on multicultural education was powerful. Religion, to me, working with churches, that was the toughest part. You would think that banking would have been the toughest part, right?
churches.
Working with the churches proved to be, I think, the most challenging. And it's because our churches are still so segregated. I mean, I live in downtown Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. 3 blocks from me is a Catholic church. 2 blocks further is a Catholic church. One is predominantly white, the other is predominantly black. And this is,
Yeah.
2021. And I don't think that necessarily, I think the challenge we still have is that when we look at unifying across organized religion, there's an expectation that communities of color want to be
Integrated
in a predominantly white church, when in reality, those churches have a strong history of cultural preservation and celebration that they don't want to be watered down by moving into a predominantly white church.
Well, I think they also function as haven. You know what I mean? And it's like
absolutely.
the way of dealing with the white world, right? Too.
Right. But even with that said, I mean, even if we looked at, okay, because of those reasons that we've just mentioned, churches stay separate and apart based on race in some ways. This notion of building like brother and sister churches, for example, a lot of times people don't even respond to that. Like, and again, my experience in working with around issues of diversity and race relations is that the people who have historically been marginalized and oppressed are much more compassionate and willing to meet folks halfway. Much more. Which is shameful. I mean, we still have so much work to be done. But however, like what happened on the U.S. Capitol, at the U.S. Capitol in the past week, I hope that there's a wee bit of an awakening, at least, that results from that, because clearly, there were symbols of white supremacy throughout that entire fiasco. But what really gives me hope is looking at our young people. And I think it really sucks that they have to inherit yet again racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism and all of these other aspects of diversity that we as the elders have not been able to get right. However, when I listen to like my children and their friends, and I see how they interact and who they interact with, and how foreign in a lot of ways some of the issues that our generation has are to them. Like, you know, like for my kids, it's like they can't comprehend how you would not be friends with somebody because they're from a different ethnic group, for example, or how you would not be friends with somebody because they might identify as LGBTQ. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
that's just so foreign to them.
Yeah.
So that gives me a wee bit of hope.
Yeah. 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 There is this quantum leap, that I think is a product of that work, and the efforts that led up to that work, that folks are starting at a different place than you or I did. Because there are still these days where, I've had students over the years at 20, and I'm just thinking, man, I wasn't even thinking about that until my 40s. Like,
Right.
you're starting there. That's so cool. That's so cool.
It is cool.
I,
And I think the other thing is, you mentioned before having compassion towards ourselves. And I think part of that has to do with humbling ourselves. And that's another way that, white privilege, I think, has hurt us. Because we don't, as white folks, we don't tend to really humble ourselves on a whole bunch of issues in general, Um, so just being able to say, I didn't know that.
yeah.
I didn't know that. And I think of myself as someone who is pretty progressive and pretty well informed, and definitely an advocate and an ally for social justice and equity, and yet every once in a while one of my kids will tell me something, and I'll be like, yeah, you're right, you're right. Um, like for example, my daughter will not constantly, but regularly correct me on the use of pronouns, and I will say, you're absolutely right. I apologize, I have to do better. um, your friend has identified a certain way the whole time I've known them until recently, and so it's a new habit that I have to develop, and I have to do better. I acknowledge that. um, And I look to them to teach me, because they do see the world through a different lens than we've seen the world. And a lot of times I think as we get older, some people think that we're automatically the wisdom keepers, and that becoming an elder makes us
Anybody thinks that's
wiser.
trouble.
But I just, I I really disagree with that. I think that young people have a lot to teach us, because they do see the world through a different lens. That said, one of the other things that you and I have talked about is embracing becoming an elder. And, I don't know, the society that we live in glamorizes youthfulness, and we're an anti-aging society, and there's like nothing natural about that.
Mortality.
And I think that it also it's also led to us not appreciating elders and their wisdom in the fullest capacity that we can. And me coming from a folk life museum perspective as well, there are so many traditions and ways of life that are really important, and that are being lost because we don't value our elders. We don't. And look, I mean, not that every elder is the beacon
As
of
an elder.
light or knowledge or wisdom. But so often, I think we ascribe certain things. One of the things I tell my kids is being college educated doesn't make you wise, right? You might have some book smarts, but I know a lot of people who never went to college are much wiser than I'm ever going to be.
Brilliant.
You know? and I think that a lot of our elders have had life experiences that have given them some perspective that we don't have yet, and that definitely my children don't have yet. Um, but that as a society we don't tend to value. We have such a focus on being youthful and
Yeah.
maintaining a youthful appearance, and just all of these, really a shallow look at how we move forward. I mean,
Well, I mean, can we qualify this a little bit too? Because I think in some ways it's white folks, like, because the black folks in my life, right, and Latino folks I know. I mean, it's been interesting to see Latino folks, like I eat at this little taqueria, uh, and their black elders that'll come up, and just watching the interaction, even across racial and ethnic lines, there is a whole different thing going on than's going on with white folks.
oh no, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm speaking we. I'm
Yeah,
meaning
yeah,
you and
yeah,
me
yeah,
as
yeah.
white folks. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we look at the globe, I can remember, and this was years ago, that I had listened to a story. It was probably like on public radio or something, um, where there was this conversation in Japanese culture, that there had been such a focus on work and achievement and earning, um, that this tradition of and the elder child being the person who took care of the parent as the parents aged, and that being seen as an honor, to be able to care for your aging parent, with the stressors of all of these other expectations, uh, that honor seemed to be kind of lessening culturally. I remember listening to this whole conversation on the radio and thinking, wow, caring for an elderly parent as an asset, as a benefit, as a privilege, as opposed to some type of burden,
Yeah.
because so many times in our society, that's what it's come to, and how sad that is, and how disconnected, so many of us have become
Yeah.
in that way. Um, like we have so much to learn from other cultures and from our elders, um, that I don't want us to miss that, and and teaching us how to be good elders too, and how we mentor,
Yeah. We're in
the
trouble if I've got, yeah. Well,
what's that?
well, if, well, maybe I hope, can we do this again? Because I'd really like to spend a lot of time on what exactly an elder is, what constitute an elder, right? In your mind, the other things I'm just thinking about is that, this is probably too simplistic, but it seems to me the power dynamics kind of in white families. Well, let me back up. Like, my parents were totally, focused on the elders in their family. My grandmother and grandfather, right? She was a matriarch once my grandfather died. But there was no joy in that relation. There was some joy in that relationship, but there was also a lot of other stuff. And I don't know. I'm trying to articulate a thought, so just bear with me for a second. Um, well, I can tell you this. When there's things, for me, the living in a culture that objectifies and commodifies humans through capitalism, through patriarchy, right, and objective, just does it in so many different ways. I don't know if I've told you this. My parents disowned me so many times for my political work that it became a joke. Like, and I just would always remind them, like, I didn't know you owned me. Like, and let's look at that language. Where did that language come from? Where does that mindset come from? That you can toss me away if I do something you disagree with? Like, what does that say about our relationship? What does that say about our family? What does that say about your quote unquote love for me? You know, and it seems to me that whiteness, capitalism, and all these things, um, especially in industrialized societies, right, created these families that are just oftentimes, specifically those are the privileged, right, where it's no wonder to me that we have disproportionate numbers of suicides, mental health issues, substance abuse in white families, and even white affluent families. Like this
Right.
lack of connection, depth, acceptance, love that manifests in all kinds of pathologies, right? And then people in my own family, there was so much trauma. Like my sister hated coming home because of the unresolved issues. Do you know what I mean? Like, so for me, the kind of larger social um, byproducts are lived out in the home too. I don't know if I'm being very clear about this. And it, in
No.
a way, for white folks that I don't think we've really delved into. There's a I'm having a guy on in a couple of weeks, Derek Jensen. He wrote a book called Language Older Than Words, and he's a controversial figure, but he was the first male writer I've ever read that wrote about the sexual abuse he experienced in his home at the hands of an affluent lawyer dad, you know, and he does this really great job of like asking the questions, what kind of human could do that to their children? What's going on in that human's heart and mind to treat children as possessions, as not even humans, just objects for sexual gratification, right? There's like, what kind of pathology is going on there? And not only that, how does that link up to a pathology that's societal, that everybody's a resource? We don't have personnel
That's
departments,
what you said,
right?
that people become disposable.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then we're all alienated from ourselves. We're alienated from one another. Um, so I say all that to say I think there are reasons you don't see. I used to joke, I keep waiting to meet Andy Griffith, like and Mayberry. Let's be really clear, pretty racist. You notice nobody's married in Mayberry, which is a little, folks in the closet, Floyd, Barney. Who knows what's going on like in Mayberry? It's a little weird if you think about it, right?
There's no traditional
Black
relationship.
folks, and it's North Carolina. I'm like, damn, what's that about, right? But all my life I've been searching specifically for men who were loving, who were not wanting to engage in a pissing match, who were not controlling, who were the father we all dream to have, but we don't because of patriarchy, masculinity, right? Um, so I think there's some real reasons why we don't have elders, you know. Um, I've been fortunate enough to meet a few men and women that have just loved me in a way in pivotal moments of my life that made all the difference in the world. So there are there, but short supply. And I don't know about you, I just encounter a lot of white folks who are damaged and hurt in a way deeply, that haven't recovered from trauma from childhood.
No, I think there are a lot of people
Yeah,
who are still hurting, and some people who don't even realize they have open wounds.
yeah, yeah,
Um, trying to stuff that down.
yeah,
Um, I also think, though, that despite all of this ugliness, and there's so much of it, we see it. We see this hatefulness, this um, inability to accept or embrace, definitely embrace anybody who's seen as the other, um, by some folks. Just despite all of that, I'm still hopeful. And I don't know, you and I have talked about that, I want to be the eternal. I don't want to, I want to acknowledge reality and that ugliness and hurtfulness exists in our world, and it's not okay. But I also want to be that eternal optimist who really believes that we can do better, um, that people can be reached, that there's that we're,
Well, is it a binary though? Because I mean, what I keep encountering is like, to whether it's about climate change or about a variety of things, um, I don't think it's like optimism or cynicism or pessimism. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
and there is this other place in there. I guess for me, I want to fearlessly look at what the facts are to the degree I can understand them. Um, and that is indifferent to cynicism or pessimism to me, or hopefulness to,
no, I think that's definitely legitimate. And I don't want it to be a binary.
but I bring that up because it's hard to talk about stuff without folks emotionally reacting, or being triggered, because let me put it a different way, especially around climate change. I generally don't talk. There's a variety of subjects I don't talk about unless I'm asked about them. Um, and then I ask, do you really want to know what I think? or, or are you looking for an answer you want? Because those are two really different things. And not only that, it takes a lot of kind of psychic and emotional and intellectual energy to kind of articulate some things that I find uh, painful. Um, and I don't want to do all that if folks are looking for an answer. Like, for example, most of my friends with kids, I don't talk to them about climate change. I don't. Now, and at the same time, you and I inherited a fucking mess too. Like, this seems to be the human saga to me, that and we inherited a mess, but we also were the benefactors of so much human greatness, in my opinion. You know, tomorrow's MLK Day. Like,
Right.
of all the people we know and all the people we don't know. I mean, my students always, I have never, I don't know how you feel, I have never felt like my life is mine. I feel like I am part and have a responsibility to a larger collective. That's,
Oh, absolutely.
you know what I mean? And not only that, that I am truly the benefactor of all the courageous humans that have fought, died, bled, cried to further this human experiment in freedom. Does that make sense? So
Absolutely.
it's kind of both of these things at the same time for me. And I don't, there's not any hopelessness in that at
Mm-mm.
all. Like, I have no idea what's going to happen at all. I mean, I can look at what facts I can see to the degree I can see them, and and talk about them, but that's about it.
I think what I was trying to say is that, in spite of how bleak those facts appear to be, and I think that's one of the things that leads to disconnect for those people who are privileged enough to be able to do that. You know, I mean, I know people even today who will say, who will say, I want to have a good day, so I'm not even going to listen to the news.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
wow, that's a high degree of privilege to
yeah,
me to be able to say that. Hey, I don't want to be bothered with the aches and pains of what's going on the rest of the
yeah.
globe, basically, you know. But even in spite of all of the facts that are out there that are seemingly and realistically negative in their impact, um, I mean, I still believe that we can do. I haven't given up
Well,
on
no,
human.
no, no. I guess, but there's something deeper in this to me, because um, again, the folks I know that are, you know, and you know this too, right? Not only are the folks that kind of live under the boot of all of this not as traumatized by the rest of us by facts. That's what I keep encountering. Like the shit that stresses me out so forth, everybody else, it's kind of like Ron Chisholm in that driver's license story, right? He's like, ah, don't worry, you know, this of all the shit I've got to put up with, that's you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it's we're all in these bubbles of privilege, like you said, right? And I think someone recently said to me that he couldn't wait till COVID was over because it was stressing everybody out and he couldn't wait to get back to normal. And I was like, well, what's normal? You know, because he had been talking about privilege. And I think there's a part of me that says, well, normal for a lot of people here is American privilege.
Right.
You know, we're in this place where we're all upset because we can't go out and eat and get our hair cut, or some of us, right? And then there's some serious issues around food security and housing and jobs and layoffs and evictions, right? Like we both know, like normal is cultural, and you know, I guess all I'm trying to say is I don't know even how to say it. This I think our psychological and emotional response to things comes from that place of privilege oftentimes, you know. And one other example that might be helpful, then I'll shut up. When Trump got elected in Portland, I might have said this to you when we talked before, it was so fascinating to watch the response. And Portland is such a trip to me because it's the widest, most liberal. They just decriminalized all drugs. They have a naked bike ride. Weed was legal when I was there. And Trump gets elected and shit gets set on fire and there's people in the street marching and raising hell and so forth. And I'm like, man, I lived there 4 years. That is the most chill place. Like, what the fuck are y'all mad about? Like, y'all got racism and all this other stuff. The people that should be doing that's the folks in the South. And that should be going on all the time. But white folks had their bubble burst in Portland that the country could elect Donald Trump. Right. It's kind of like in Freedom Summer when the Ivy League students saw the hoses, fire hoses, and the dogs. They couldn't believe that was their America. And all these liberals keep saying that this is not us. Oh, yeah, it is. This is us.
Exactly
This is
us.
our
Yep.
history. This is what we do when power is challenged. Right. So the students in my classes, all the white, kind of very liberal, progressive students, were in an emotional mess that was very real. You know, with the realization that Donald Trump was going to be president, and the students of color were like, welcome to my world. Like, you know what I mean? And I was just like, welcome to the South, folks. Like, you know, and not only that, it's not even going to affect most of the folks in Portland. Like, they're going to deal with ICE, but y'all still haven't dealt with y'all's shit in terms of your racism, your gentrification,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you and I mentioned a little bit about that in our last conversation. I think one of the things, because we're both Southerners who've lived elsewhere.
Yeah.
Um,
And came back home.
right. And came back home.
Yeah.
We're both Southerners who are insane.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, what I found, and I was in the Northeast, was how racism presents itself is very different.
Yeah.
And basically, what I found in general, of course, was that in the Northeast, people were very concerned with being politically correct. And so they would never, I never had anybody say anything overtly racist to me when I was there. But it was interesting because I didn't always know where people stood because of that. You know, in the South, people don't hesitate saying overtly racist stuff, but at least you know where they stand. There's an honesty there.
Authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah, that is undeniable, you know, and I think it's kind of a transparency that I was talking about that I value. You know, I don't value racism,
Yeah.
but I do value honesty. And I think that it gives us in some ways an advantage on addressing,
Yeah.
so many of these problems, so many social justice issues, because at least people are upfront about where they stand and what they believe in a lot of ways. So we know, like they know that I'm as far left as they're going to get in Breaux Louisiana, right? And then I know where they stand as well. And I don't know, going back to elders, I have to say this is another thing. So I'm in this little community in South Louisiana, Breaux Louisiana, about 8,000 people, a rural parish.
It is a great place too.
What's that?
Is Mulots in Beaubridge?
Yeah, well, it was. It's no longer Mulots, unfortunately.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
wow,
become something
that's
else.
sad.
I know.
What a great.
Um, yeah, probably, 60% white, almost 40% African American, probably less than 1% other, um, in terms of racial demographics. Um, but I've been here 21 years now, I guess. And I remember very clearly, and not that long ago, less than a decade ago, being able to, when I have my little coffee shop here, um, there was a gentleman here who was very respected. He was an entrepreneur, businessman here. He had been an Army Ranger. He had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And he, I knew him from years before, but when I had my coffee shop, he was getting really up in age and his health was starting to decline. But he loved to come and position himself at a table in the coffee shop, and his friends would just come and join in. And they inevitably they would talk politics. And Mr. Johnny and I were very different in our political leanings or how we would vote, but there was a respectfulness um, that always allowed us to have a meaningful conversation, you know. Um, like he looked forward to hearing my perspective, and I was interested in knowing his perspective, and I feel like we've become so polarized in this country on every issue imaginable that people aren't even willing to lean in and listen. Like there's this assumption that we have nothing in common and you don't have anything worth hearing, when it's just, that's not true. There's so much for us to learn, and just making the effort to find some common ground. And I mean, even if the only thing we can find is that we both feel passionately about this issue, right? Like at least we're both invested in something that we think is important. And I guess that's what's been disheartening to me recently about what's happened to us politically in this country, is just that it's so very hard to find somebody who's even willing to engage in a conversation with someone who has a different perspective.
Yeah, it's scary and sad. And I talk to a buddy of mine all the time about this. We're no longer curious about one another, and the truth is, if we sit down and talk about one another, I think we got a ton of stuff in common.
Yeah.
I mean, we generally do, especially outside the political realm. But this goes back to that it seems to me, and for the last 30 years, I've been trying to figure out, well, how do you do work to end dehumanization without being dehumanizing? I mean, that's a tricky, because again, for me, the supremacy will remake itself in self-righteousness, that I've got all the answers and you're the bad which I'm still in the soup with everybody else. I'm implicated in the clothes I wear and my life, buy gas, and we're all implicated in this situation. But I think you're right. I think there's some larger structures that help account for it. I read a book a couple of years ago that's pretty good called Hate Incorporated, and it's all about news networks and kind of the creation of Fox, and realizing that they didn't have to play to the whole spectrum of political thought like the news that we grew up on, that was once at 6 o'clock at night. You had your local news right at 11 and 7 and 6, and you literally had a half hour national news, and they played to, across the spectrum. And this isn't to blame Fox, but Matt Taibbi, who wrote the book, who's also a journalist, basically argues it just became very lucrative to polarize people into political camps. So Fox figures it out first, but MSNBC, CNN, and the rest kind of jump on board. Not to mention social media, clickbait, right? And I think we're all also very addicted to being outraged. The liberal folks I know have been outraged about Donald Trump for 4 years. The liberal comedians have picked up on that and made an industry with it. CNN, who gave Donald Trump millions of dollars in free, basically, advertisement, which helped him get elected, then made more millions, and all their revenue has gone up, in all these networks. There's a way that I think we've all been manipulated. The local conservative talk radio folks here, hopefully they're going to sooner or later have a conversation with me, because, they're talking about, well, everybody's mad. Well, you've been for 30 years telling white America that their country's being stolen from them. Immigrants are going to kill them and rape them. Like, you've been scaring them. You've been priming them for 30 years to come to this moment, and excluded all other perspectives. You've really been peddling fear, So
Yeah.
all that's to say, I think this inability to have a conversation with one another, and the way I approach it these days is, I live with working class people. I live in a trailer. It's a buddy of mine's that I'm just kind of house sitting for. I work with working class folks. I don't talk about any of this with them. I try to be a good human, and if folks want to have conversations, I'll have them. But I think it's been more powerful to prove I'm not what they think I am. Does that make sense? Like, with the conservative pundits here, I actually agree with them on a number of things, and they would actually discover that if we could have a conversation. The problem is getting to the point where we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. It's sad. And I also think if we don't make the initiative to reach out, nobody else is going to do it. It makes too much money. We're all self-segregating on our social media. We all choose our platform. We don't seek out information that disproves what we believe or tries to, but at the same time, I think we have some agency in that and some responsibility, too. And that's one of your gifts, though, too. I mean, I think you were always a person that was engaging other folks, and seeing their humanity in them. And again, it gets really common. You were the first person that introduced me to gay folks here in Valdosta, like, that really humanized that whole thing and pushed my homophobia. And then I realized, gay folks can be racist too.
Well,
it gets complicated,
It really does.
Yeah.
It really does.
They're just humans too, in a social system that teaches them stuff that's just wrong, So anyway, hey, we've been at this for like 2.5 hours, so I should probably let you go.
I think our last conversation was like 3 hours, and it doesn't feel like it, Mark.
Yeah.
So
Well, can we do this again in a few weeks, and let's come back to the elder thing, because I would really like to talk about what that means. Like, I have my Andy Griffith, Morgan Freeman, like I can go down this list. They're mainly male, but I also with Maya Angelou, like
Yeah.
wise folks, but who knows who they are in their private life, right? But like what is eldership?
I think a link between what we've talked about today and possibly a conversation about, being a good elder, um, is that we're all imperfect, and we're all we all need to be humble. We all have a lot left to learn. Um, and I think that's something a lot of the people that I look to as wisdom keepers or sharers, I guess, instead of keepers, uh, is that I'm always amazed by some of the people that I have just been in awe of, because they seem like, and they are such spectacular humans, uh, that when I get into really in-depth conversations with them, they're incredibly humble, and they're very willing to admit that they haven't known everything, and they never will.
Yeah.
And that learning is a lifelong process, and it's okay to mess up if you learn from that, and you try to improve on the next go around.
Kind of how it works most of the time.
I mean, I hope, um
I mean, I think the other thing that I would say, and again, I hope we revisit this, you know, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've met some people that I felt I want what they've got. I'm not talking about, you know what I mean? I'm not talking about material stuff, that they've got this kind of groundedness. And I think one part of that I see, it's folks who have been interested in understanding themselves. They've grappled with their baggage and their hurt and healed, right? Figured out ways to make peace with things that have happened with them, and like you said, learn. And when they do that, it seems to me that they have a lot of space for other people.
I think that's a really good.
You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, you can bring stuff to them and they don't personalize it. They can make that distinction between your pain and your struggle, and what's theirs to take on and what's not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. No, I think that's a really good observation. I also think that there's a genuine interest in connecting for them, like they really want to understand it, everyone, and find what connects them, not what separates them or makes them inaccessible,
Yeah.
but what do we have, what connects us, what binds us
Well,
as humans.
yeah. Well, I'd reframe it a little bit. I think love,
Oh,
people that really realize that life is complicated. We do not know what people have lived through. And you know what I mean? Like, and again, realizing that most things aren't personal, even if you're screaming at me. It's like having that sense of groundedness and self to realize whatever is coming at me. I think this is what Jesus knew, like, and the Buddha knew it. Other folks knew it, that, you know, there's this story where the Buddha, some king comes to him and starts screaming at him and, tell him all this stuff. And the Buddha says something to the effect of, right now you're offering me a gift of your hate and anger, and I refuse to accept it. That's yours to carry,
wow.
And I thought that's pretty, like, being able to do that and love somebody. And, I think that's, again, I think we talked about this last time, the story of the crucifixion, and this guy that's been tortured, not being pissed and saying, look, they don't
I
know
don't know better.
why
Yeah.
they're doing, like, and I'm not there.
If they knew better, they'd do better. But I think if we're working towards that,
Yeah,
though,
yeah,
that's a good thing.
yeah.
Do we ever, all of us or any of us, get fully there? I don't know. But I agree. God, and it's weird how we've become stingy with even saying "I love you," to like who we say it to and how we mean it, and why have we done that? Why are we not, as a society, just more willing to freely tell people we love them? I was listening to some radio program, and they were talking about this Wendy's employee who decided that she was going to tell everybody who came through the drive-through that she loved them.
Nice.
That was like the good news for the week. They were talking about all these good news stories because people were tired of hearing about the pandemic and about
All
rioting.
down with everything.
Um, and I thought, really, what would we think if we were going through a drive-through and the person said, thank you for your order, I love you, and like how that can shift us, and just not knowing, you're right, not knowing what other people are doing and what's motivating,
Yeah.
whether it's fear or hurt or whatever that sometimes motivates behaviors that we don't understand. I think it's all the more reason why we need to just be kind.
Yeah.
Um, so,
I hear you.
ah,
Well, that seems like
I
a
love
good
you,
place. I
Mark.
love you too. I knew this would be a great conversation, so thank you for making time. And
Oh,
I really am serious. If you're willing to do it again, I'd love to continue the conversation.
of course, I'd
Yeah,
love to.
yeah. Not that
Um,
we know anything, but it's great. You know, I don't, I don't know. You
We're
know,
trying to know, so that's a good
with
thing.
that, and I've also kind of made peace with not knowing that it's okay to not know. Like it's that.
Like we're never going to know
Well,
everything.
that, and I've probably done the most damage in my life when I was certain about stuff. When I just, I had a monopoly on the truth. Damn it,
That's true.
So I like this place of uncertainty. You know,
Kind of exploring.
yeah, and it it feels light and loving. Now I'm not saying that I'm always pleasant and not still an arrogant ass at times, but it certainly feels better than being being absolutely sure.
I'm okay with admitting I don't know everything and being, reminded of that. And um, yeah, and I think that for me, that's been a really those two things have been really helpful in kind of fostering my love of learning and growth and trying to uh, the phrase "if they knew better they'd do better" just keeps coming to mind. So I want to know better, I want to do better, and I'm okay with people telling me that I need to do something differently, or I need to do something better, or I hadn't considered something. So um,
I also just think we need each other to know ourselves. Like I have this version of who I think I am, but it's my friends that will just have a come to Jesus with me that I go,
oh God.
oh man.
And it's your really deep friends
Yeah,
that can do that. Not all friends can do that,
yeah, yeah.
your friends who don't give you, who don't go
Yeah.
along with the
It's
few
like, man,
alternative. Yes,
gonna call bullshit on that one.
that's right.
Well, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording. We can say goodbye afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, hold on just a second. But thank you, Melanie Harrington, for making
Oh,
time. Hopefully, we can do this again.
thank you, Mark.